Hello everyone and welcome to tonight's episode of Beginner Breakdown. My name as always is Alex Moellering and I'm excited to show you our lesson for tonight. I'm going to give one quick heads up. I'll remind you at the end as well. But we're actually going to be switching the nights for this class. So next week, Monday, I believe it's the 29th of August, we're actually going to be having Road to 2000 at this time. And then Tuesday, the day after, we will be having a Beginner Breakdown. So for all those loyal fans who enjoy it on Monday nights, I want to give you the heads up. We are going to be moving to Tuesday, and I hope you can join us. But if not, remember that even if you can't come live, we'll still be available afterwards on YouTube when the episode is uploaded. So stick around for the series, at least in that space, if you'd like to. Now, last week, we were looking at the Lucina position, which involves both sides having just a king and a rook, and one side having a pawn, and we contrasted that with the Philidor position, and we didn't really get into the weeds with the Philidor, and so I thought about doing that tonight, but I wasn't confident in my ability to fully explain the intricacies of that position for beginners yet, so I decided to postpone that, and instead wanted to just have a fun week. And one of the really fun things about chess, something that really gets your blood flowing, is the idea of the queen sacrifice. We've seen these in master games, maybe you've had some in your own games, but it's hard not to get excited when a queen is sacrificed out of the blue and leads to a victory. So I thought tonight I would look at some of those, some really famous games in history that have queen sacrifices, but I also want to show not just here's something cool about chess, but also how we can maybe try and apply the ideas of these in our games. And to do that, I'm going to break it into checkmating patterns. So this first one that's already on the board here should look pretty familiar to a lot of people. If you're not familiar, this is called the smothered mate pattern. And the idea is the king is fully enclosed in all of these pieces, right? So there's a rook and some pawns. You can change it up in other scenarios, but basically the king is fully stuck in the middle of the board. At one edge, just completely enclosed by their own pieces. And because the knight is able to jump, we can deliver this really nice checkmate, knight to c7, where normally just having one knight, I mean, we have a pawn over here, but a knight on its own normally wouldn't be able to deliver a checkmate. Since black has locked the king in such a way, we're able to get this smothered mate. Now, how does this connect with queen sacrifices? Well, there's a few ways. But this is one of my favorite ways to introduce this smothered mate pattern. So again, this will be the first of several different kinds of checkmating patterns we're going to look at. But if you haven't seen this position before, take a second and see if you can find the winning sequence for white. And keep in mind, it's going to involve this smothered mating idea. So how do you think white should play to get an advantage? Either our live audience, or if you're in the chat, you're welcome to suggest some answers as well. Well, it's all right if you're not too sure. This one is a little tough, but what we want to do is we want to end up having the king fully surrounded by pieces. Now, in this particular position, we have a little bit of a troubling situation ourselves, where we are down in material, right? We only have our knight versus this rook and pawn. So we are down 3 points. Additionally, our king is not in the best position. If our queen moves too far away, probably not there, somewhere like here where it won't be traded, we're going to face this really annoying move, queen to a1, and probably will lead to a back rank checkmate in most positions if our queen moves away. So we need to do something very forcing. The good news for us is because of the nice position of our pieces, we have some forcing options that can lead us to win this game. So if you haven't found it, that's okay. I'm going to spoil this one. But we'll have another practice example in just a moment. But the nice move here is to play knight to f7 check. The idea is kind of twofold. We're hitting the king with the knight, and there's a problem. Black has two moves. You can either move the king or you can take the knight, but neither of these are going to work. if you take the knight, then we have a very simple way to win this game. It is not to take the rook, which would again lead to black back ranking us on a1. We would have to block with the queen, but then they would take the queen. Instead, it is to realize that this rook was doing too much. It was guarding this square on f7, but also guarding the queen. So if they take here, we will happily eat their queen and get a back rank ourselves. So this is no good. So instead, black sees this threat and plays the very simple move king to g8. Now the position is back in our hands, and we need to do something very careful, right? Now something to notice is because our queen is lined up with the knight and the king, if we move our knight, we're going to get a discovery. A discovery is any tactic where you move a piece and the piece behind it reveals an attack. In this case, it would be a discovered check. The problem is, if we just bring our knight back to where it was, even though we're calling check, it's not a big issue for black because they are attacking our queen and can simply remove the piece. So we have to be a little more creative than just, making a discovery here. We actually have to use another tactic related to discovery called a double check. In this case, the move is knight to h6 with the idea that we are now attacking the king with two pieces, the queen and the knight. And you cannot take either of them, right? If you take the queen, the knight is still calling check. If you take the knight, the queen is still calling check. A double check forces the king to move, and the only safe space is king to h8. And here is where we get to our queen sacrifice. Remember, for the smothered mate pattern, we need the king to be fully enclosed, and the only way to do that is for them to get their rook onto g8. But they're not just going to voluntarily put it there for us. So instead, we can coax them along with the really nice move, queen to g8 check. This is forcing a response, and because our knight is placed to defend the queen, the king can't take it, the rook has to take, and we can finish it off with knight to f7 checkmate. So this is our smothered mate sequence. The king is fully smothered by all of these pieces, and we use a nice queen sacrifice to do it. Another practice example of this position comes right here. So again, notice for part of this pattern, what's really important is the queen is lined up with the king, and we have our knight in between. So our knight is going to be able to move and make this threat. Now in this case, it's different. Our queen is not under attack, so we don't have to get any kind of double check here, which is good because we can't. The knight and the king are on these diagonal squares. There's no move our knight can play to call check. But the question is, where should we put our knight to get the maximum benefit here? Any thoughts? Where should we put our knight to get the most power out of this position? c5, exactly. Knight to c5, revealing the attack, and critically, we're controlling these really important squares around the king. And now, again, it doesn't matter that the knight's in danger because this is a discovered check. And technically, the best move for black is to block with the queen, but this is really just delaying the inevitable. So if black doesn't want to just give up a queen, which won't change anything, it'll just make it one move longer, they're going to have to move their king. Now, the best move here would be to play king to b8. If you play king to d8, the problem is, remember, our knight is controlling this really pivotal square. So queen to d7 would just be checkmate. After king to b8, the problem remains the same. This actually reverts us right back to our original position, and now we can set up to get the double checkmate. First, we bring our knight to d7 to call check with the knight, and there's nothing that can interrupt this check. And then, the critical move here, we bring our knight to b6, double check. You can't take the knight, and our knight needs to defend the square where the king is going to be so that we can sacrifice. Once again, king to d8 will just lead to queen to d7 checkmate, defended by the knight. So the king goes to b8. But now, just like last time, we can sacrifice our queen here on c8. And after the rook takes, the only move, knight to d7, is checkmate. So this is a very important pattern to know, but it comes up in some really awesome master games. One of them here is one of the games known as the Immortal games. There's a series of these that after the game, they've been so, commentators and masters alike just think they're such excellent, beautiful games that they are called Immortal. So this is actually the Boston Immortal. White was played by Franklin Young, and black was played by El Dore, or Dore, not sure how to pronounce that name. But this happened in Boston in the late 1800s, and we're not going to break down the specifics of the game. It was a Danish gambit of sorts. I am going to show you kind of the main idea and what processed here and how it ends in our really fantastic queen sacrifice. So white is not worried about capturing this pawn. They really want to prioritize development, hoping that if black takes, they can recapture with the bishop and just have their bishop pair, their knight ready to get involved, and really set up a nasty attack. Black chooses to take on e4, castle, and knight to d6. A bit of a weird move, blocking this pawn, but looking to threaten the bishop and try and, exchange some of white's aggressive pieces. White now plays a really kind of wild move, knight takes c3, allowing the bishop to be captured, which black takes. Rook to e1 check. Okay, black plays the reasonable move, bishop to block. Knight to d5. Now we see why white allowed black to take their bishop. They wanted knight to c3 to come with this really devastating tempo, threatening to win the bishop. In this position, black plays knight to c6 to defend, and bishop to g5. One of the rules with a pinned piece, right? This is a pin where the bishop can't move because then the king would be in check. You want to attack pinned pieces. You want to put lots of pressure on them. And so white is doing an excellent job pressuring this position. Black plays f6, and white plays another good move. Plays rook to c1, offering up if black would like to take this bishop. We can take the knight, so we'll trade material, but then the rook on c4 will be ready to swing over, double on the e file, and put even more pressure on this bishop. Black declines this trade and plays b5, and white takes it anyway, does not care that this is defended. What's the idea here? Well, after the pawn takes, now knight to e5. Kind of an incredible looking move. Really hard to break it down. But the basic idea, in the game, black responds by taking the bishop. Had they taken this knight, it doesn't really change anything. Or let's say they take with the knight. If they take, white is ready to actually sacrifice this rook as well, threatening again to win here on e7. And if we see something like pawn takes, then bishop takes and the queen is trapped. So lots of threats in this position. In the game, takes the bishop. We have queen to h5 check. And here's where I want you to start putting on your thinking cap. g6 to block. And now we're entering the kind of critical position. White to move. And keep in mind, we're eventually going to work towards a smothered mate. It's kind of incredible how this happens. But there's a lot of tactical ideas. White has given up a lot of material in order to make this attack happen. But now it's all going to pay off. White needs to do something really spectacular here to try and win this game. So what would you play if you had the white pieces? Knight g6, very, very reasonable move by Ruthikska, I believe is how you say your name. Yeah, this is a really normal idea, especially when there's kind of sacrifices after something like f6, and the queen comes to h5. The idea with knight to g6 is after the pawn takes, the rook is not defended anymore. And this might be good enough to win. Actually, it's not. This is good enough to draw. So knight to g6 is a very good move, but black actually has a way to draw. If they take, we can take here. King to f7, only move. Something like queen to h7 check, king to f8. And we can put a lot of pressure on, but remarkably, black is going to be able to survive this position. They have just enough resources out here to get a draw, and we can continue with perpetual, but nothing better. Knight to g6 is a really nice looking idea, but there's a move we have to do first. And in the game, Franklin Young found it. It's knight to f6. The idea being, now, if you take this knight, which you have to, right? If you play king to f8, this is not going to be any good because of queen to h6 checkmate. All of these squares are covered. You have to take the knight. And once you do, now we can play knight takes g6. We activate this with a check, and we're getting our final piece involved. Really a remarkable move here. In the game, black blocks this check with the queen, somewhat surprisingly, but it kind of becomes clear why if you look at the other options. If they play something like knight to block, for instance, then we actually have checkmate in 2 moves. Knight takes h8, and queen to f7 checkmate. If instead you block with the bishop, this isn't much better. Here you might see something like knight to e5 check, and queen f7, again, the same idea. So there's not really much better you can do. If you try something like king to f7, this also isn't going to work. We might see something like knight to e5, and where the king has a lot of places to go, but wherever you go, it's not pleasant. For instance, if you go king to, let's say, e7, then we have knight takes e6 check, forking the queen and the king. The rook is still involved. Checkmate is probably coming very soon. Something like king to g7, we have queen to f7, and another nice checkmate. So there's really not much that I can do here, which is why in the game, queen to e7 instead was played. Rook takes e7, bishop takes, now the piece de resistance, knight to e5, and we begin to see the problem. If you notice, this is the same pattern we started with. The king only has 2 options, either to go to f8 or to d8. If you go to f8, it is immediately checkmate on f7, so king to d8. And we have our smothered mate pattern. The knight comes in and calls check. We have double check. Queen to e8, forcing the rook to capture because it's defended by the knight. And our beautiful smothered checkmate. White wins with the only piece they have is this knight. They've given everything else up. A really beautiful game, the Boston Immortal. Feel free to check it out and look in more details, but this is just a beautiful end. And actually, the smothered mate sequence also is how the game of the century ends. This was between Donald Byrne and Bobby Fischer in 1956, one of the most famous games of all time. And it's a very complex game. We're not going to go into all the details. I want to get to our ending position. So lots of ideas happening. We get to this kind of interesting middle game where White's king is exposed, black has sacrificed some material, and it's a very imbalanced position. Instead of saving the queen, black plays an intermezzo and calls check. The king goes and hides on f1. And black plays this really remarkable move. Bobby Fischer, incredible move. Bishop to e6, allowing the queen to be taken. And even more surprisingly in the game, it wasn't. Bishop takes e6. If the queen had been taken, there are a few different ideas, but the main way black would probably try and get an advantage is taking with check, and then doing similar to the smothered mate sequence, but without the queen. We're going to just kind of loop our opponent and win some extra material. And it would be a very imbalanced position, but Bobby would essentially argue that, yes, you have the queen, but all of my pieces are incredibly active and dangerous, and your king is stuck, and your rook is doing nothing. You actually need this knight to stay here to guard the back rank checkmate. So really kind of incredible, complex position here. I want to focus on what actually happens in the game, because Donald Byrne did not take the queen. He kind of saw this as not working out in the long run and decided to take the bishop. And here, Bobby finished the game really in style. Queen to b5 check. In the game, bishop to c4 was played, just delaying the inevitable. We've seen this all before. Knight comes here, call check, and line up with the queen when the king returns. Knight to g3, double check. Queen to f1, and knight to e2. So really beautiful queen sacrifice checkmate. This smothered mate pattern is something important to keep in mind, because it can happen in your games. But this is kind of the first way we might look for sacrificing a queen to get a nice checkmate. The next one I want to look at is the opera mate. This actually comes from the famous game Morphy's Opera House, which was played by Paul Morphy. We're actually going to look at that game in a moment. But the basic idea of the opera mate is the bishop and rook are working together to cut off all of the king's escape. When the rook lands on d8, it's also going to cut off these two squares, and usually either one of our other pieces or one of black's pieces will be in the way. In this case, I've put a pawn on f7, so that after rook to d8, there's no safe square for the black king to go. Some examples of this position, I'm actually going to flip the board here for black, would be something like this. In this position, black can choose to sacrifice their queen by playing queen to d1 check, and after the bishop takes, the only move, now the rook comes in and works with the bishop to deliver this checkmate. So again, this is an example of this pattern. See if you can find how black can achieve a similar winning position in this example here. So it's black to move. What would you do to win this game? Queen to f1, yes, we need the king on this square so that when we move our bishop, we will call check with the rook. Now, where should we put the bishop? Yes, another double check, always an important resource to look out for. There's no time to block the check with the rook or to take the bishop. The king has to move, and we finish it off with rook to f1. And again, we see this same pattern. All of these squares are occupied. This is checkmate. In Morphy's Opera House, the game itself, very famous. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of lectures on this game. So I'm not going to go through all the details. But Morphy has the white pieces, and he continues to put pressure on white's king. Eventually, he makes this really nice sacrifice, knight for 2 pawns, with the idea that black's king is too open and white's pieces have such strong control over this position that it's very hard for black to survive, and in fact black doesn't. Knight to b7, queenside castle, and Paul Morphy sacrifices his rook for the knight, knowing that one, worst case he can win it back, but also to bring his other rook into the game. To e6, and here is where we get the really nice position. Bishop takes d7, knight captures, and Morphy wins the game in 2 moves. Using this opera mate pattern, he needs to get his rook and his bishop working together. So how does he do it? Yes, we need to deflect this knight. It is in the way. If it moved, then this is checkmate, and we can do that with queen to b8. There's no move to stop the check other than to take the queen, and now rook to d8 is checkmate. This same pattern happens in several other games. One really nice example, another famous one, is called the Sucker Punch game. It's only 11 moves long, but Richard Reddy had the white pieces against Tartakower. This happened in the early 1900s. But the main idea of this game is black seemingly gives up this pawn on e5. So white is up a pawn. And instead of trading queens, which would just let white keep the pawn, black plays this check and recaptures this way. Ultimately, probably not the best idea because notice that white has a lot of development, but black is thinking that this knight is pinned and could be a very easy target. If white tries to defend it with something like f3, there could be some consequences. Black can kind of continue to build pressure in this position. White plays this really surprising move, though, queenside castle. Now black sees, okay, well, you didn't defend the knight, so I'm going to take it. If you take with the queen, then rook e1 pins the queen to the king. So black chooses to take with the knight, and this falls right into Richard Reddy's trap. How does Reddy win this game? And keep in mind the kind of opera mating pattern we just looked at. I'm sorry? So we could play rook to e1, and it's possible this might help us out. We might be able to win the knight back after something like, say they play bishop to f5 or pawn to f5. We can still play f3, and we might be able to win the knight back. But there's actually something even better, and someone with a funny name in the chat has found the right move. Queen to d8. Really nice. And notice again how the bishop and the rook are online. The king has no moves. You have to take. And now the really nice move, bishop to g5, hitting the king in double check. You can't block or take in either instance because you're still in check from the other one. The king has to move. In the game, I believe king to e8 is played, allowing for the opera mate. Even if the king goes to c7, you still can't escape because of bishop to d8, checkmate. So another really nice example, oops, let's go back to, here we go. Another really nice example of the opera pattern. One final one, this was a blitz game between Mikhail Tal, fan favorite, and Tigran Petrosian, the Iron Tiger, played in 1975. And also a relatively short game. This one, I believe, only 21 moves. Petrosian is playing kind of very solid, very safe, a French-style structure with these knights ready to cover all of the center squares, not trying to give white much space. But what happens here is white manages to open things up a little bit and then make some really incredible sacrifices, what Tal is known for. And this is the first example. After queen to a4, the position is dead even, and instead of taking the queen and trading, something like this, also note that you can't try and win this knight, even though there's two attackers, because after knight takes, queen takes, and we have lost the queen as a defender, so this also doesn't win a piece. Mikhail Tal plays a really nice move c4 with the idea that, well, wait a minute, isn't this just a free knight? Because there's a pin here, right? Mikhail Tal does not care about that. He happily recaptures the knight, and black beats this rook. So black is up a full rook. Now we do get this knight back, so black is just up the exchange, but Tal is banking on this idea that black's king has not castled, and now the queen is on a1, so it really needs to get back into the game. So there's some time that needs to be spent. Petrosian plays queen to a6 to try and get the queen involved, but even that's going to be a little too late. Rook to e1, and this king is very exposed in the center. Queenside castles, not the move you would like to play when you have an open c-file, but you need to get the king to safety, and it's going to take too long to get the bishop out of the way. There's just too much pressure on the center and on black's king. So queenside castle, bishop to f4, and rook takes d5. Black seems to be, recovering. There is a bit of a problem, though. Rook to c1 check, and the king goes to d8. Now, bishop to g5 check. In this position, king to e8 is played. f6 doesn't really work because there's a nice sacrifice on f6. White is going to be able to pick up the rook. Oops, that's a bit of a spoiler. And also, if f6, after bishop takes, then king to e8, well, why didn't you just play king to e8 in the first place? Now you've lost the pawn. So king to e8 is played in this position. And another really fantastic move, knight to e5. What's the idea here? Well, unfortunately, black does not have time to take the queen. If rook takes queen, then we have basically the opera mate, rook to c8 check. And with the knight covering this last square, it's okay that the rook started on the c-file. Rook has to drop back to d8, and this is exactly the opera mate. Now, Petrosian sees the threat and doesn't just take the queen. Petrosian plays the move b6 to defend c8 with the queen, but this opens up another problem. Mikhail Tal now deflects Petrosian's queen with this really nice move, queen to a4 check. And after queen takes a4, because the queen is not defended, so what else is there? c8 is no longer defended, and the game ends with this really nice opera checkmate pattern. So another really good one to keep in mind. Okay, we've looked at the smothered mate, we've looked at the opera mate. I have 3 more for you. The first one is Anastasia's mate. This is a very simple idea, but it's kind of like a back rank, except it involves the knight. So in this case, the knight is covering both b6 and b8. Black's king is stuck on this single row, and so in this position we can play the move rook to a3, and this is going to be checkmate. So the knight is cutting off these really crucial escape squares, and we're going to be able to use this to our advantage. So here's the first practice example. White to move, and using Anastasia's mate, find the winning sequence. What should white play here? Knight to e7, a really nice start. So we're going to get a forcing move, and we're putting our knight in position to guard all of these squares. Okay, only one move, king to h8. Yes, and here's the queen sacrifice. We don't need this queen anymore because now we've gotten rid of the pawn, the knight is covering all these squares, and we have this really nice rook to h5 checkmate. Similar pattern can be seen in this position. It's actually the exact same pattern, just on a different side of the board. Start with knight to e2. The king has to move, and you can sacrifice the queen on h2 because of rook to h6. Now there's a really cool game here. One of Magnus Carlsen's early kind of, don't know the word for it, but people started to look out for this kid after this game. He was playing John Ludwig Hammer in 2003, and he had the black pieces and had a really nice winning sequence. So again, a complicated game, even though it's short, worth looking up. But the basic ideas are as follows. So Carlsen seems to be playing kind of a Pearts or Queen's Indian style setup. It is now, sorry, King's Indian. It's now Pearts because e4 has come on the board without c4. And both sides are getting kind of set up and developed. e5 striking at the center. And knight to h5, Magnus's intentions are likely to start trying to attack the king side of the board. So he's putting his pieces in position to do so. Pawn takes pawn. And instead of simply recapturing, knight to f4 is played. Intermezzo targeting this bishop, which is not defended, so there's no time to recapture the pawn. The bishop goes to b5, and now Magnus recaptures on e5 with knight. Knight takes knight, and again, another intermezzo. Instead of recapturing the knight with the bishop or the pawn, Magnus plays queen to g5. And there's no time to save the knight because we are threatening checkmate. There's also a threat of knight takes h3 because this pawn is pinned. So those both need to be dealt with. Knight to g4 was the solution, saving the piece that was destined to be recaptured on e5, but unfortunately this also allows for queen takes b5. Magnus picks up a piece anyway. Knight to b3, and Magnus plays knight to e2 check, which seems a little questionable. After knight to b3, the bishop is attacking the knight, so we need to do something here. But most people would be worried that after knight to e2, this knight is going to get lost in the fray. Right? White has a lot of control over this area of the board, and it's going to be hard for this knight to escape unscathed. What is Magnus thinking? Well, let's see. He goes to h1. Bishop takes g4. Okay, we've gotten rid of this knight. Now rook a to e8. Bishop to e3, fortifying defense of all of these escape squares for the knight, and preparing to activate a rook potentially. Rook takes e4, and rook to e1, seeming to fully trap this knight. And John Ludwig Hammer is saying, "What are you doing, kid?" Magnus was, I think, he was very young at this time in 2003. And where does this knight go? There's no way to defend it. But in this position, Magnus plays an absolutely crushing move. Any ideas? Oh, hello, welcome from Egypt. Glad to have you in our stream. How should Magnus continue here? It seems like the knight is trapped. Yes, really brilliant queen sacrifice. Queen to h5, check. With the problem is it's not exactly Anastasia's mate because the king is not, blocked from both of these squares, but the knight on e2 is doing a very crucial job of keeping the king trapped on the side of the board. The only way to stop checkmate is to take the queen, but now rook to h4 is checkmate. So Anastasia's mate, another one to keep in your wheelhouse, can come in handy in some very cool circumstances. All right, we're down to two more. The next mating pattern I want to look at is called Pillsbury's mate. The idea here is pretty simple. You have kind of a normally castled king, but crucially this pawn is missing, or we find some way to get rid of it. And our bishop is just dominating these squares around the king so that you can play a move like rook to g1 and win the game, the rook and the bishop together. So this mating pattern is called Pillsbury's mate. In this position, there's a bit of a problem. We want to get this Pillsbury's mate sequence, but unfortunately our bishop is not on the right side, right? We need the bishop to be looking into this corner to cut off all these squares, and our bishop is on h6. So how should we continue as white to find this checkmate? What would you do? Okay, good way to start, rook to g1 check, and black only has one move, king to h8. Okay, bishop g7, and the king has to return. f6, exactly. And this is just checkmate. We've used this kind of nice check and then discovered check to force the king to go where we want him to go. And now we can get our bishop on the right square and align our rook. A really nice kind of sequence to know, right? Keep this one in mind. It comes up a decent amount of the time. Right, a little more complicated, but we're going to end up with a similar pattern. The things to note in this position, certainly we have our rooks lined up and ready and our queen. A lot of danger here on this file. Now we can't just play checkmate immediately because there is a knight defending g7. Also note that we have our bishops ready and open to attack. So what is the way we can actually win this game? How does white get checkmate in this position? A little more complicated than the last one. Okay, so sacking the queen on g7, knight takes would be the only move. How would you continue from there? Okay, and we're actually going to get something very similar to last time. Rook g7 check, and now we have our bishop on the right diagonal and the rook here, but there is a bit of a problem. How do we actually finish our food in this case? It's a little trickier than it looks. Yeah, rook g8, very well found. And it's important, right? Because a lot of people would just say, what if I just bring the rook back somewhere, and shouldn't I get the same thing? Well, the problem here is now we give black the opportunity to block in some way, maybe something like knight to e5 or even f6, and shut down our bishop. We don't have time to do that. So as you found, and as Wegener88 in the chat found as well, rook to g8 is a double check. This is forcing the king to move. So king takes, and now the main idea is we have time to bring our other rook into the game, rook to g1, check, and there are no moves for the king. The only way to stop checkmate is to block with the queen, and rook takes, delivering checkmate. Really nice sequence. Well, what game does this one come up? There was a really cool game between David Janowski and Friedrich Samisch in 1925 that actually features this mating pattern. So Janowski had the white pieces, and we start out with a kind of Nimzo Indian structure, bishop to g5 and c5. And again, we're not going to go too deep into the openings. This is almost now kind of morphed into some kind of London system, except the bishop's on g5. both sides are playing relatively standard ideas. White kind of forming this battery, black hoping to get their rooks involved in the game. And white strikes with h4. Rather than castling or doing something safe, h4 with the idea that after h6, queen to d2. And if you take, then we can retake with the pawn and activate our rook, and this is quite scary. Samish did not want to open up the rook. This is kind of the same as the fishing pole maneuver, and it's very dangerous for black in this position. So instead of doing something like this, again, the knight's going to have to move, and this is going to be very bad for black. Knight to g4 was played, opening up the bishop as well, trying to get a lot of pressure in this position. The bishop drops back to f4, e6, saving the queen, knight to e3, hoping to trade, and there is a trade of these knights, and pawn to h5, hoping to kind of lock down white's attempts to press forward. But this still gives white a nice opportunity. White says, okay, I need to attack your king, and I'm going to lift my rook to do so. E5 played. Pawn takes, knight takes, and there's a big trade here in the center. Bishop takes, attacking the queen, and bishop to e6, with the idea that now maybe you have to move your bishop somewhere, and there's threats of rook coming to e8. The king is still in the center. So black is hoping that they will have some nice compensation and some pressure for the pawn they have given up on e5. But in this position, white has a really, really nice move. I believe the only winning move to complete this game. How does white continue and really find a beautiful move in this position? And again, keep in mind our Pillsbury's mating pattern we just looked at. Yeah, I see a few people in the chat with the right idea. Wegener 88 and Lost Leon 1234. Glad to have a first time chatter here. The excellent move here is queen to h6, exclamation point. We are sacrificing the queen, but not by taking a piece. We're actually, this isn't a forcing move. There's no checks, there's no captures, but black is just totally lost here. You can't take the queen, which I believe is what happens in the game, because of Pillsbury's mate, which we'll see in a moment, and nothing else really works, right? Because both of these bishops are threatening, you can't stop them both very easily, right? You can't take here because queen to h7 is mate, and we can't play f6 to stop the threat this way because we still have queen to h7, something like king to h7, and there's different ways to win this. Bishop to g6 is a very strong move, but perhaps the simplest would be something like just trading on d6 and then playing rook to e3 to keep the king locked away, threatening bishop to g6 checkmate. And you might see something like rook to h8, opening up space for the king, bishop to g6, and if king to f8, then queen takes h8, checkmate. So that's just one possible line. There's other ways black could have played, but f6 is going to be losing in every variation. So instead, we have g takes h6, and now, very simply, rook to g3, checkmates. Really beautiful Pillsbury's mate here. Another one to keep in your back pocket. And I want to show you one more mating pattern. So we've already looked at the smothered mate, the opera mate, the Anastasia's mate, and now Pillsbury's mate. The last one I want to show you is Bowden's mate, because this is actually going to lead us into probably my favorite chess game of all time. This was the first chess game I remember watching and getting super excited about the game. And so the basic idea with Bowden's mate is it involves both of the bishops, and they're going to be cutting off the light and dark squares by swinging across to opposite sides of the king. In this position, all of these squares are cut off, and there's usually some other material or other pieces we have that are keeping these last two escape squares off the table. So here's an example. White to move and win, and you have to be careful about how you do it, but there's a very nice winning sequence here involving Odin's mate. So white to move, what would you play? And yes, knight c7 check with the idea that after bishop takes, yes. And you have to take here first, right? Bishop e5 doesn't work immediately because we have c6. Knight takes is a forcing move, cutting off all the options because we have this pawn nicely placed on e6. There is no space the king can go, and after you take, there's nothing left to block. This is checkmate. So very nicely found. Here's our second example. White to move and find the winning sequence here. And while you're thinking about that, someone in the chat, yeah, is it just me, or did chess players back then allow the game to proceed to mate instead of resigning when it's clearly lost? Yeah, a lot of games today end in resignation. I think back in the day, there was a more romantic sense to it. They liked to, see these really pretty positions on the board. Today, people just know the game so well and know their opponents that they realize, I don't need to have it shown. You can find it in an engine later. But there is something nice about this kind of romantic style of chess. Okay, in this position, I see Lost Leon again has the right suggestion. In this position, really stunning move, queen to f6, check, with the idea that black's king is fully encompassed and our bishop is dominating these light squares. The only way to stop this is to take the queen, allowing our second bishop to get involved and cut off all of the remaining squares. Bones mate, really, really beautiful. And this leads us to perhaps my favorite chess game of all time. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this one just because I appreciate it so much and I have some history enjoying this game. This is called the Peruvian Immortal. Earlier we looked at the Boston Immortal game, but this one was played by a Peruvian master of chess named Esteban Canal, and he was playing against an anonymous player in Budapest in 1934. The game begins with Esteban having the white pieces, and he plays pawn to e4. Black continues d5, the Scandinavian defense. Not as popular these days, but at the high level, still a very popular opening among average players. And Esteban plays the main idea, take the pawn, and attack the queen with knight to c3. In this position, there's a few things you can do. Most of the time, you will either play queen to a5 or queen to d8, although there is growing popularity for this move queen to d6. In our game, we have queen to a5, hoping to keep the queen semi-active, perhaps get it on a nice diagonal to pin the knight to the king. And something to note in these types of Scandinavian positions is a very important move will often be this pawn to c6 to give the queen a nice escape back home. But let's see how the game continues. White plays pawn to d4, taking up space in the center. Pawn to c6, as we just said, giving the queen an escape if she needs it. Often you will see something like bishop to d2. Chess Dojo Live, thank you for the raid. Welcome in, everybody. We'll be wrapping up here in about 10 minutes, but we're looking at the Peruvian Immortal game, one of my favorite chess games of all time. In this position, it's white to move. So black just played c6 with the idea that you want to give the queen an escape. Often in these variations, white will play something eventually like bishop to d2, and then try tricky moves like knight to b5, hoping to get some forks with the discoveries on the queen. So black is kind of preempting that and preparing just to bring the queen back to d8 if things get a little dangerous. White continues very simply with development, knight to f3, and bishop to g4, pinning the knight immedately. Black doesn't want any shenanigans here and seems content to trade off the light squared bishop for the knight. White plays bishop to f4, developing the bishop to a nice active square in the center, putting more controls on e5. Knight to f3 was controlling this square, but now with the pin, it is perhaps easier for black to try and play this move. White would like to prevent that. And so instead, black plays the simple move c6, and this is a very common pawn setup you will see. Black wants to get the bishop out before they play e6 so that the bishop is not blocked in, but now this is a very solid setup. The pawns are going to control all of these light squares, and this dark squared bishop will often come in and try and fight for the rest of them. So white plays h3, asking the bishop if it really wants to stick around or if it's just going to trade, and the player with the black pieces chooses to trade off the bishop and queen to f3. Now we have bishop to b4. So this is a decent looking move, pinning the knight, forming kind of this battery with the queen. I'm sorry, the knight was already pinned, but we're adding pressure and locking down this knight, really trying to gain control over here. And there's not really a threat, like in some positions you might play something like a3 to take the bishop, but that's not really a concern because the queen is on a5, and so the rook will be hanging, right? This pawn will be pinned. So not really something that black has to worry about here. And yeah, a decent looking move, although I might say again, given what I just said about this pawn structure, it seems like this bishop might be more important as a defensive resource than an offensive one to cover all of these gaps, especially looking at how commanding white's light squared bishop is on f4. White plays bishop to e2, looking just to castle, perhaps get out of the pin. And black plays knight to b7. And this is a very interesting move that immediately, I think, sparks an idea in Esteban Canal's mind. And he may have had this idea already, but I'm sorry, after bishop and knight e7, or knight d7. This is, it looks like a very normal looking move, right? Developing the knight, controlling some of these dark squares that we already talked about, maybe being a little weaker. But this is kind of the first piece of the puzzle that's going to lead to one of my favorite checkmates of all time. In the game, Esteban plays the move a3, which is a little bit confusing, right? As we just talked about, it seems like there's not really a threat to take this bishop. So perhaps the idea is white wants to just prepare for once they have castled and connected these rooks to then have this pawn activate as a threat. We don't really know the rating of Esteban's opponent here, so it could be reasonable that he's kind of switching up the move order to maybe try and confuse his opponent. Instead of castling and then playing a3, maybe he's doing this first, and maybe his opponent will forget about it. I'm not really sure what's going on in his mind or his opponent's, but it's kind of an interesting move here, a3, and it's the start of a really nice sequence. Black is, as we've said, not afraid of this threat. There's a pin on this rook. It's actually even worse than a pin, because if you take, you're not just losing one rook, you're probably going to lose both of them, although maybe white can block. But this is not going to look ideal for white. So black just plays a very sensible move and castles queenside. This is maybe a little questionable, given again how much control this bishop has, and as we will see, that is an extremely relevant feature of the position. Maybe it would have been a little wiser to try and play something like knight to f6 or knight to e7 and then kingside castle. But black wants to, I guess, really quickly develop and perhaps put their rook on the d file without, wasting time with their king being in the center of the board. So this is the move they play. And in this position, it's white to move and find a really excellent idea. So if you have white, what would be going through your mind? What might you play? And see if you can find the best sequence in this position. While you're thinking about it, I'll just give you some more to kind of take note of. Perhaps black is arguing that since white has not castled, right, this would look like a very natural move, right? Castling to unpin the knight and to connect the rooks. Perhaps black is arguing that since white has not castled, their castling is going to, counteract the fact that they haven't developed their knight yet. And maybe they're still deciding where they want to put this knight. Maybe they don't want to deal with the pin. But this is maybe some of what's going on in black's mind. So a very natural move would just be to castle, but white has something a little sneakier in mind, and a few of you in the chat have already found the idea. I'll give you one more minute because it's just such a really beautiful idea. All right, well, I hope you're ready for one of my favorite moves in all of chess. Just such a fun position. In this position, white plays the really incredible move, pawn takes on b4. Maybe I spoiled it a little bit by showing how much of it didn't make sense, but there's a really big problem here. In this position, black plays the move queen takes a1, and instead of blocking, white plays king to d2, allowing queen takes h1. What is white doing? Esteban Canal, giving up 2 rooks. How do you finish this game? Why did you do this? Well, to Wegener88 in the chat, boom shakalaka, the really excellent queen sacrifice in this position is queen takes on c6, check. The bishop is covering all of these squares, and the only move in this position is to take with the pawn. And now we see Boden's mate come alive with bishop to a6 checkmate, cutting off all of the escape squares. There's nothing black can do. And if we go back and take a look, it's a really outrageous position, I know. It's so incredible. After pawn takes on b4, it's actually almost just winning right now because this queen can't take the rook, right? The best move would be to go somewhere to defend, but you can't just go back on the A file. Obviously, we have control of it. And even something like queen to b6, I guess you can play this way, but you've already given up a bishop, and we've activated white's rook. After queen takes a1, it's actually much better for white to play this king to d2 move, because if you block with one of these pieces, then you're giving black a move to, pull the queen back somewhere and survive. But after king to d2, now there's just nothing you can do because the rook is attacking your queen and you're either losing the game or you're losing your queen, and you can't move the queen back anywhere, right? Anywhere that defends the pawn is covered by white's knight or bishop. It's a really incredible position. After queen takes a1, king d2, knight e5, any good? I don't think this is going to solve the problem. It's clever. You're kind of re-attacking our queen, but I think very simply we can just take the knight and reactivate the threat. There's still this threat of queen sacking, and everything seems the same. And I don't think there's an idea of something like rook d4. I'm not positive. I think just bishop takes and let's say queen takes h1. We should still be, winning back plenty of material in something like this. Knight e5. If you try and move the queen anywhere or open up the king, I think you're going to be able to stop checkmate immediately, but white's still going to get plenty of compensation for it. Because remember, we first take this bishop, and you're going to have to give up this rook, and you're also going to lose this one to even try and stay in the game. So not quite going to work, but it's a nice attempt. It's a good thing to look at, kind of a reverse kind of queen sack countering one with the other. Something good to look at, but it's such a fun position. Taking here, allowing black to hang themselves with moves like knight to d7 and then queenside castle, and just having such a beautiful control of these diagonals. Let's see it one more time. Queen takes a1, king to d2, queen takes, and just this beautiful explosion, queen takes c6, and white wins the game. So keep these patterns in mind. If you want, do something like me and get inspired by these master games with these really beautiful checkmates and see what you can learn, how you can apply them to your own games, whether it's the smothered mate, the opera mate, Anastasia's mate, Pillsbury's mate, or this Boden's mate, and there's dozens more. So feel free to look into them on your own. Thanks everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed it and hope to see you again next week. As a reminder, we are going to be switching to Tuesday nights for beginner breakdown. Monday nights at this time will be Road to 2000. So please stick around for both of those, but just be aware that we are going to be switching the days for those two. So hope to see you all again soon and hope you have a great week. Take care.